Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I've been thinking for some time I wanted to revisit Belgravia, one of my very earliest pub videos, and give it the proper Tweedy Pubs treatment with the historical research, a bit better editing, more interior shots and so forth. Just off Belgrave Square is Wilton Crescent. I think this is one of Belgravia's gleaming terraces. And there is a little alleyway off here which will take us to pub number 1, the Grenadier. So taking a look at the exterior first, I would say it looks a bit Georgian, but it's probably early Victorian. It has a tall ground floor frontage with the interior accessed via a set of steps. It's stuccoed at that level, 3 windows and the front door. Those are interspersed with white stucco pilasters. Beneath the windows are blue fielded panels, and I assume somewhere in that lower ground floor are the cellars. The upper floors are of whitewashed brick. The red sentry box is apparently a more modern addition. Surprisingly, this is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. I've always liked the interior here, but it never seemed to me as though there was a large amount of original material. There are actually 2 entrances to this pub, one at the front and also a side door on Old Barrack Yard. Camera say this could suggest that there were originally 2 distinct bar areas inside, but the side door leads into one of the rear rooms, which camera's listing notes were not originally part of the public space of the pub, so that doesn't quite add up to me. There's matchboard panelling around the walls and on the bar counter, although there it is apparently a later replacement, but perhaps consistent with the original style. The pewter top to the bar counter is also a later addition, but that is something which was quite typical in the Victorian era and not so common today. The bar back may actually be one of the oldest fittings, although there's some nice carving at the top which could be Victorian stylistically. The shelving lower down looks a bit more modern to me. However, that could just attest to the fact that this was originally a down-to-earth pub for the workers at the nearby houses, and many of the pub's fittings may have been quite simply adorned. The ceiling is covered with banknotes from around the world with messages on from the people who have given them to the pub, and there's some military prints and pictures on some of the walls. Let's take a look at the history of the pub. This is on Wilton Row, which was earlier known as Wilton Crescent Mews, and it appears to me that this road has not yet been laid out at the time of Greenwood's map of 1828. You can, however, see the Footguard Barracks, and that gives a hint to where the pub name comes from. Camera's What Pub site suggests the Grenadier dates to 1843, and there may be some confusion with another nearby pub of a similar name, which accounts for the history on the pub's own website. That states it became a pub in 1818, having previously been used as an officer's mess, and that must be referring to a different location. The earliest newspaper mention is in 1847, at which time the address is given as Wilton Crescent Mews, and that suggests Samuel Thomas may have been its first licensee, if indeed it was established in the 1840s. By the time of the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, Wilton Crescent Mews has clearly been developed, and you can see the pub marked with a PH. Note you can see the steps drawn on at that time as well. The more modern history of the pub seems quite intertwined with cars. To start with, the garages along Wilton Row are filled with some rather fancy cars, presumably belonging to the residents of the nearby mansions, and you can occasionally get a glimpse of some of these as you're passing by. In 1955, the pub was apparently the starting point for the Oxford and Cambridge Far Eastern Expedition. This was a publicity effort for Land Rover and saw teams of Oxbridge graduates drive their Land Rovers all the way to Singapore. However, towards the end of the 1950s, the cars of the customers at the Grenadier had become a nuisance to the local residents. In 1959, a court heard of bright young people driving their cars noisily and excitedly down the Mews. A novel solution was proposed whereby patrons at the pub were no longer allowed to drive into Wilton Row, but instead would be fetched to and from their cars by either rickshaws or sedan chairs. Possibly as a continuation of that legacy of the Far Eastern Expedition, in 2022 the pub was bought by a manufacturer of off-road vehicles called Ineos. The founder named the company's first vehicle after the pub, having apparently come up with the idea here, and on my visit you could see one of them parked outside. I had a half of their eponymous ale, which is made for them by Woodford's Brewery in Norfolk, and it came in at £3. One thing I've always loved about the Grenadier, it is tucked down a mews, but it also has this alleyway at the side called Old Barrack Yard. And this is, in fact, as I showed in that old video of Belgravia, a sneaky shortcut to get you to the Nag's Head. Go through this archway and we come to some of the backs of the hotel that's around the corner, whose name I've forgotten. I'll put it on the screen. Even slightly more difficult than usual to figure out the way through, because there's some sort of construction work happening back there with that archway. But if you come out onto this side road beside this hotel I still can't remember the name of. I remember now, it's the Berkeley. And then across the road from there is Kinnerton Street, where there are in fact two pubs. Pub number 2, the Wilton Arms. It's a listed building and apparently a relatively rare example of a surviving 1820s public house, with most pubs of that era having been substantially rebuilt in the late Victorian period. There's a blind window on the second floor with an inscription of the name of the pub and the date it was built, 1826. That's consistent with where most of the major development of Belgravia commenced. It's stucco fronted with a wood frontage to the ground floor, although that's likely 20th century. It's currently painted in an unusual caramel sort of colour. There are doors at either side. As usual, probably that signifies that there were once 2 or more distinct bar areas inside. Between the doors are small paned windows, which today have some coloured and some etched glass in them. It has a mostly fairly modern feel inside, but there are perhaps a few points here and there which are noteworthy. The bar counter is interesting, with some quite elaborate wood carving. Not sure what the date is on that though. Historic England's listing suggests that these slender cast iron columns may be original. One corner has retained some recessed fielded panelling and a wood fireplace surround that certainly looks a bit older than most of the rest of the interior we see today. There are a few streets in this area which take the name Wilton, most notably Wilton Crescent, and they were named for Thomas Egerton, the 2nd Earl of Wilton. He was the second son of Robert Grosvenor, the first Marquis of Westminster. It's the Marquis of Westminster who owned all the land on which Belgravia is built, and much of it is still in the hands of the modern Duke of Westminster. The earldom of Wilton was passed down to Thomas by special remainder. This is a construct in peerages which allows succession by somebody other than the eldest son. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for the Wilton Arms was in 1842, an account of a fatal carriage accident. In 1856, prizes were presented here for a model yacht sailing competition held on the Serpentine, with flattering encomiums. What a word. You can see it marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. It was a Whitbread pub for most of the 20th century. Then, in the era that I knew it best, was ran by Shepherd Neame from 2002 to 2021. It's now run by a small pub company called Inder Pubs, who currently own, I believe, 7 pubs around London. There were 2 hand pumps, one serving London Pride, the other serving Allsop's Pale Ale. I think I was lulled into a false sense of security by the fact they're based in Burton-on-Trent, and there was a since 1730 on the badge, which suggested to me this might be something like Bass Pale Ale, but it was in fact a more modern Pale Ale style, of course. So it's made with Aurora and Cascade hops. I don't object to the former, can't stand the latter. For what it's worth, it was £3.35 for a half. Pub number 3, the Nag's Head. This is only a few doors down on Kinnerton Street from the Wilton Arms, at a point at which the buildings start to feel surprisingly cottagey. I think it's just a 2-storey building here, stucco on the upper floor and a timber frontage to the ground floor, with the name of the landlord, Kevin Moran, written on it. It's decorated with window boxes and hanging baskets. It also has these handy folding tables which I think are attached by hinges to the frontage. There's usually a couple of tables set up in the street as well. The front bar room has an extremely low bar counter, possibly the lowest in London. It's topped with a very handsome array of hand pumps which look old. Beyond there, the till also looks venerable. I would guess that's Edwardian. One wall has a mutoscope, which presumably offered some kind of what the butler saw type experience, and an antique fruit machine, or a kind of bagatelle machine possibly. In some ways, this is a forerunner of modern modern pinball machines and the bizarre phenomenon they have in Japan called pachinko. The opposite wall has a fireplace containing cast iron oven fittings with a wood surround decorated with horse brasses. Above is quite an impressive carved overmantel. A set of stairs beside the bar counter lead down to the back bar room, which is always much quieter than the front. This is wood panelled again, with walls covered in prints. The ceiling is covered with what look like magazine cutouts, and there's also an antique Union flag. There's another fireplace down here with oven fittings again, and short benches either side. All sorts of knickknacks hanging from the walls, including what appear to be a set of croquet mallets, some old skis and ski poles. I think it's a beautiful Aladdin's cave of an interior, and over the 15 years or so I've known this pub, I've whiled away many happy hours here. The name of the pub probably attests to the fact that many of these back streets, these mews in Belgravia, were once used for stabling for the large houses. Kinnerton Street was not yet present at the time of Horwood's map of 1799, but it was at least partly laid out at the time of Greenwood's map of 1828. The Nag's Head was likely opened as a beer house in the wake of the Beer House Act of 1830. This made it significantly easier to open a business selling beer but not spirits. However, it can be a bit harder to trace the history of these places, as they don't leave quite the same paper trail. In the 1856 Post Office Directory, there's a list of the businesses on Kinnerton Street at the time, but there's no number 53. Note the Wilton Arms is listed here at number 10. It's now at number 71. So that suggests that there has been some renumbering on the street. And the pub's history or London wiki site suggests that the earlier address of the Nag's Head was at number 19, where, unlike the Wilton Arms, the pub is not named and we simply see the name of the proprietor and their occupation. Beer retailer. Possibly the earliest mention which clearly states the name of the pub is from 1863, when the proprietor at the time was in hot water for erecting an oversized sign. It isn't marked with a PH on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. Again, I think this may be an example of how these beer houses often fall between the cracks, although it is marked with a PH on the later mid-20th century Ordnance Survey map. It was likely still a beer house in 1900 based on this directory listing, at which time the beer retailer at number 53 was one William Viggers. It looks like William Viggers' tenure as licensee ended in 1914 when it passed to Alexander Budd. In 1916, Alexander Budd was in court charged with assaulting the mother of some boys who were dancing on his cellar flap. Once again, this was a brewery-owned pub for much of the 20th century, originally Incoop, which later became part of Allied Breweries. Kevin Moran bought the pub in 1994, it's reported on the What Pub site, and it has been a free house and an independent pub since then. As a side note, I'm always curious when people buy a pub, what exactly did they buy? An article I found suggests that the Grosvenor estate still owns at least the freehold and possibly even the leasehold of this premises. I'm slightly loathed to bring this up because I suspect people will rather obsess about it in the comments, but we have to talk about the prices. For some time this has been a notably expensive pub for a pint, and as it happens, on the day of my visit, Time Out published an article that the Nag's Head was now charging £8 for a pint, and indeed I can report that on my visit it was £8 for a pint of Guinness. So a few things I'd like to say. First of all, this is not typical for Belgravia. I talked about the prices for all the other pubs I visited today, and this is some way ahead of all the other beer prices in the area. As alluded to just now, it's not actually clear, despite this being a free house, what level of ownership Kevin Moran, the landlord, actually has over the property, and I wouldn't be surprised if he is being financially squeezed one way or another. Finally, I just look on this as a sort of admission fee to a museum. It is a beautiful pub interior. It's very well preserved, hasn't changed a bit in the decade and a half that I've known it, and I'm always happy to be here, even if the prices are rather eye-watering. Kinnerton Street brings you out onto the very luxurious shopping street of Mottcombe Street. I think there probably used to be mews from here that would connect through to where the Star Tavern is, but today the best shortcut is to just go through Waitrose. I've always been quite a fan of that Waitrose. You get a distinct sense that people's butlers are shopping for them in there. Anyway, Just beyond there we get to, I think this is Halkin Place, and that leads on to Belgrave Mews West. Pub number 4, and I've always considered this to have a particularly handsome frontage. It is the Star Tavern. Taking a look at the exterior first, the name of the pub is written in the stucco towards the top of the building. It has a wood frontage to the ground floor again, currently painted black with some brass trimmings. There's particularly some nice brass fittings on the front door, and I like that kick plate. Some etching to the windows, but I think that's probably more modern. Also a few panes of stained glass in one of the windows with star motifs. More hanging baskets and window boxes to be seen here, and this is very much a common theme in Belgravia's pubs. It is a listed building, like the Wilton Arms, but Historic England note that it is only included for group value, whatever that means. Looking inside the pub, this is another one that's on camera's list of historic pub interiors. The bar counter has handles at intervals, and I couldn't help but think that one of the panels looked like it was perhaps designed to slide open, but the member of staff I spoke to said that they didn't move. The main bar room is now separated by this archway. It's a nice, restrained and fairly old-fashioned sort of an interior. It's usually nice and quiet in here as well, no music playing. There's an upstairs room called the library with another bar counter. Camera's listing suggests that this is probably interwar. The toilets here have Thomas Crapper sinks, and they are supported by corresponding TC initialed brackets. So let's take a look at the history of the Star Tavern. Belgrave Mews West was likely laid out in the 1820s. Here it is at the time of Greenwood's 1828 map. It's not actually marked by name at that time, but it's that run between Lowndes Street and Belgrave Square. The pub was likely built sometime after that, and the earliest records of it are from the 1840s. The earliest newspaper mention I could find was from 1860, just talking about the licence transfers. Later on in its history, Eddie Chapman in the 1950s was apparently a regular here. He was a wartime spy and double agent during World War II. It's often written that the great train robbery of 1963 was planned here, a slight whiff of the apocryphal to me. Why would you plan a crime in a public place? The earliest written allusion I could find to this is in a 1966 book called The New London Spy by Hunter Davies, which seems to just make a throwaway remark that if the masterminds of the robbery ever used a pub, it would be one remarkably like the Star. It's a Fuller's pub today. I just went for a half of good old London Pride, and that was £2.90. Pub number 5, the Antelope. This is another example of stucco to the upper floors with a ground floor frontage in wood. There's etched glass in the 2 central windows on the ground floor, which reads Wine and Spirit Merchant, and that's flanked by doors either side. Slightly unusually, both doors are still in service today. One of those doors has lettering in the panes which reads Restaurant on one half and Saloon Bar on the other half. There's some intriguing decoration on the walls between the first and second floors. I couldn't quite work out what these symbols represent, and maybe they're just random decoration as you often find on pub buildings. Looking inside the Antelope, it's a roughly rectangular shaped island bar with rounded corners and matchboard panelling on the counter. The gantry above is of a slightly different style with fielded panels, and I'm not sure the two are contemporary with each other. There's some sporting memorabilia on the walls, including a pair of cricket bats, and I think the pub has its own cricket club, as attested by a board on the other side. A smaller room off to one side is marked as a snug. I get the sense this is a later addition to the pub. An archway leads through to a back room with a sign above it reading Wines and Spirits. There's a fireplace in that back room with a possibly cast iron surround and some tiling, and there's some nice wood panelling in there as well. The name of the pub is a bit of a curiosity here. It's probably a heraldic reference, but it's unclear what or whom exactly it is referring to. The pub's own website claims it has a history that dates back to the 17th century. They don't elaborate on what exactly they mean by that, but let me quickly dispel any notion that there may have been a pub on this site going back to the 17th century by showing you Horwood's map of 1799, which shows the immediate vicinity wasn't developed at that time. Camera's What Pub site proposes a date of 1827 for the pub. At the time, time of the Greenwood map of 1828, the road seems to have been roughly laid out, but there don't appear to be any buildings on this side where the pub stands today, although this map was based on surveys from earlier in the 1820s, so it doesn't rule out a build date for the pub of 1827. The earliest newspaper mention I could find is from 1856, and harking back to that Hammersmith's pub video, this is another example of uttering, or the attempt to pass off counterfeit currency. It can be seen clearly labelled on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. It's another Fuller's pub today. I had a half of Seafarers, which came in at £2.65, making that the cheapest price for a pint. It would be £5.30 for a pint of today's outing. And if anybody is in a state of shock after the price of a pint at the Nag's Head, hopefully that goes to show that there are still some places with somewhat more reasonably priced beers to be found in Belgravia, even this close to Sloane Square. Pub number 6, the Fox and Hounds. This is a compact corner pub. It looks like bare stock brick on the upper floors. Once again though, lots of window boxes and hanging baskets. The ground floor frontage is currently painted black. There's just a single entrance here, and that's possibly a hint of a pub that was at one time a beer house. The 1910 Licensing Consolidation Act stipulated that for a pub to apply for a full license, it would need 2 distinct bar rooms, and that usually corresponded to 2 distinct entrances. Sorry that the interior shots here are a bit cursory. This was the last pub of the day and I was running out of time a bit. It's a compact interior with a small bar counter featuring some fielded panelling. Paintings on the wall feature hunting scenes in keeping with the name of the pub. Towards the back of the pub is a sort of lounge area with a slight air of a gentleman's club about it. Leather armchairs and bookshelves. Perhaps I just hit it at the right time, but there was a really nice atmosphere when I was here. It felt very much like a regulars crowd and very convivial. At the time of Greenwood's 1828 map, the street looks only partly developed, and I don't think there was yet any building on this precise location. The stretch the pub is on was called Union Street initially. The consensus from various sources seems to be that the pub dates to the 1860s. The earliest newspaper mention I could find was from 1888, when in fact there are 2 different accounts of an attempted murder at this pub. It's interesting that these 2 different newspaper accounts refer to the pub differently, one as a public house, the other as a beer house, and that possibly shows that even at the time the distinction between the 2 wasn't well understood. This does give us a useful clue as to some of the pub or the beer house's earlier history, as this identifies the name of the landlady, Annie Hadland, and we can look back in time from there to find a directory listing of 1880 where Mrs. Anne Hadland is listed at this address as a beer retailer, and she also appears in the 1871 census. At the time of the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, the pub isn't marked, probably because it was a beer house. It is, however, marked on the mid-20th century Ordnance Survey map with a PH. Perhaps the main claim to fame of this pub is that it was the last remaining beer house in London, and possibly the whole of the UK. There's a newspaper mention from 1998, at which time it was being bought by Young's, and still at that time was a beer-only house. It seems it was as late as 1999 when the application for a full licence was made. I don't think it's a Young's pub anymore. The beer lineup on the bar didn't give that impression, and the overall atmosphere here felt much more like an independent pub. I went for a half of Harvey's Sussex Best, priced at £3.40. Okay, well that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.